Hey everyone, Pastor Bob here again with your midweek Bible break. This week we're going to be diving into Genesis chapters 40 and 41 as we continue the Joseph story. There's a lot packed into these two chapters that are important for the story, dreams and their interpretation, and more than I could get to this coming Sunday in the sermon, where I'm really going to be focusing on how God's timing works in our lives. So I wanted to go over some of the details of these two chapters so that you have some background as we go into Sunday's sermon. I encourage you to read Genesis 40 and 41 to get the full story, but just wanted to fill in some blanks here. So let's dive in as we get into this week's Bible break. First of all, I want to talk about the role of Egypt in the Bible. Egypt is a frequent mention both in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. Of course, we have the story of Abraham going down to Egypt. We have the story of Joseph here set in Egypt. We have the Exodus, obviously, the children of Israel escaping from slavery in Egypt. Egypt figures prominently as an empire in a lot of the historical books of the Old Testament. And then even when we get to the New Testament, when we get to the Gospel of Matthew, remember that when Jesus is threatened by Herod the Great, when he's a baby, Joseph, another Joseph, takes his son and his wife Mary down to Egypt for refuge. So it's an important place throughout the Bible. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. That was true in the time of the Bible. It was true during the Roman Empire. Because of the Nile River Delta and all of that, it was a very fertile place, despite the fact that we see desert surrounding it on all sides. Of course, we have this view of the pyramids here that are far predate many of the events in the Bible. But it was known as a place of great agricultural wealth. And so you see these Semites like Jacob, like Abraham, coming down to Egypt to get food. And that's going to be true in the Roman Empire. The grain dole, the levy, the corn dole, those kinds of things are all coming from Egypt. Rome is importing lots of stuff from Egypt. So it's a very important place in the ancient world. But it's also a place of refuge. Abraham goes there for refuge. Jesus and his family go there for refuge in the Gospel of Matthew. But then again, it has a negative connotation. Egypt is seen as symbolic of oppression and slavery. Going back to Egypt is a negative thing. In fact, Egypt comes to represent the old life of sin. To go back to Egypt means to return to a former way of life. So we keep those two things in tension. Egypt as a hopeful place, a place of refuge, but also Egypt as a place that reminds us of oppression. And I think that's true of a lot of things. They kind of have a double meaning for us, and that's true here of Egypt in the Bible. Now, how do we date the Joseph story? It's set in Egypt, but when? We're not sure exactly. The Pharaoh of this period is not named, unlike in the Exodus story, where a lot of scholars think Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the time of the Exodus. We're not sure who the Pharaoh would have been in this time. If you know Egyptian history, this kind of corresponds to the Hyksos period. And this timing all concerns then when Semites were present and in some ways functioning as bureaucrats in Egypt. So a lot of scholars date this roughly between 1700 to 1500 BC, somewhere in there, but we're not sure exactly. We know that the Israelites are in slavery for 400 plus years, and we date that. We can make some educated guesses around when that is, but we know that it's set there. What we do know, though, is it's not unusual for slaves in that empire to rise to positions of prominence in that Egyptian bureaucracy. And that's going to happen here with Joseph. He takes on a very prominent role and a very specific role that the Pharaoh assigns him to. Now, how do we get there? Well, when we read chapter 40 and 41, we see again the theme of dreams that's popping up. The recurrence of dreams as symbolic of future events. And we've got dual dreams in both of these chapters. First of all, in chapter 40, we have the dreams of Pharaoh's officials, the cupbearer and the baker. Now remember that Joseph has been put in prison as a result of the false accusation of Potiphar's wife. Now, Potiphar is the captain of the guard, so there's a sense that Potiphar is in charge of the jail, so he's got Joseph in the king's jail, and somehow the baker and the cupbearer had gotten sideways with the Pharaoh, so they're put in prison as well. It's important to remember, too, that prison in the ancient world wasn't a place where you generally kept a long sentence. No one sentenced you to jail for life. The jail was a place they kept you while they decided what to ultimately do with you, either to free you or to execute you. You were never going to spend too terribly long in prison. And we see that playing out here in this story too. While they're in prison, these two officials of the king both have dreams, and those dreams are important. They presage what's going to happen to them. These are also two very important officials in Pharaoh's world because they are close to him, and in some sense, they're part of the security. The cupbearer makes sure that when the king is served wine, that it's not poisoned, and the same thing with the baker, keeping control of the food supply. Assassination attempts, poisonings, if you know anything about ancient history, you know that is a classic way to bump off a ruler. If you want to have a coup or you want to have a family member supplant someone, you poison them. That's true all the way through the Roman period and so forth. So these are two important jobs. For whatever reason, and we're not told exactly why, they get sideways with Pharaoh and they're put into the prison. And they have dreams. But Joseph is going to interpret those dreams, and he's going to give credit to God for the interpretation. Here again, Joseph recognizes who has been with him the whole time and that God is giving him the ability to interpret dreams for a larger purpose. Well, the cupbearer and the baker have different dreams, but they're similar in a lot of ways. The cupbearer dreams about 3 branches in a vineyard that are giving grapes that are being dropped into wine for the king, which Joseph interprets to mean that the cupbearer is going to be restored to his position. But the baker has a dream about 3 baskets on his head, 3 baskets of bread, and the birds came and start to eat the bread, which means that he's going to lose his head. He's going to have his head lifted up. That's an interesting euphemism in chapter 40 where the baker's head is lifted off of his body, whereas the head of the cupbearer is lifted up back to his former position. So these dreams, Joseph accurately interprets, and what happens to these men comes to pass as a result of their dreams. Well, the cupbearer is elevated back to his position, and Joseph says to him before he leaves the prison, hey, remember me, that I'm still here in prison. If there's a chance to get me out of here, please do so. Well, unfortunately, the cupbearer forgets all about Joseph. He goes back to his former life, and it's 2 years before the Pharaoh has a dream that none of his officials can interpret. In fact, Pharaoh has 2 dreams. And in the ancient world, if you have a repeated pattern, 2 similar dreams, that was really telling you something. Pharaoh's dreams are of 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 skinny cows, and then 7 strong heads of grain being eaten by 7 weak strands of grain. So these repeated patterns, again, are indicating something important, but no one could interpret the dreams. None of Pharaoh's officials could interpret the dreams. And then the cupbearer says, oh, yes, I remember there was this Hebrew slave in prison with me who could interpret dreams. And so Pharaoh sends for Joseph. Joseph cleans himself up, shaves. This is a very different thing. The Semitic peoples, Hebrew peoples would wear long beards. The Egyptians were famously clean-shaven. Joseph shaves, gets himself ready, goes to see the king, and the king says, can you interpret these dreams? Here again, Joseph has an opportunity to elevate himself, but he says, I can't do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And what's the result of Pharaoh's dream? How does Joseph interpret them? Well, he interprets them as meaning that there are 7 prosperous years of agriculture coming, preceding 7 years of famine. Famine was a devastating thing in the ancient world. Nowadays, we can mitigate that to some degree by shipping food from one place to another more easily. That was not the case in the ancient world of famine, especially a famine in Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the world, was not only a problem for Egypt, it was a problem for everybody around them. So Joseph says there's going to be 7 years. Here's what you ought to do, Pharaoh. You ought to store up grain during those 7 years so that you've got enough surplus to last you through the lean times, and then when it comes, you'll be ready. And the Pharaoh says, well, that's a great idea. How about I put you in charge of that effort? And so he's going to elevate Joseph once again. Here he is coming out of prison, now being elevated to a position of power. And I love the way it puts it here again. The coat reappears once more. He dressed him in robes of fine linen. And now he's on top of the world again. Joseph gets a new name. It's an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means God speaks and lives. He's given an Egyptian wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, somehow connected to Potiphar, you might notice. Priest of On, she who belongs to the goddess Neith. So he has an Egyptian wife. He's in an Egyptian role, but he's still a Hebrew slave. But he's a slave who's risen in Pharaoh's court to this high position. And he's given evidence of that position by his rings, his chains, his chariots. He's given the king's seal. He's second in command in the kingdom, the Secretary of Agriculture, if you will, in that Egyptian empire. So Joseph is once again on top, and he manages the grain supply. Pictured here is one of those granaries, a place where they would store grain, and the grain could last a long time. One of the times we were in Israel, we were on Masada, which was King Herod's mountaintop fortress down by the Dead Sea. And that had been part of the grain storage. Herod had stored grain there for times when he could escape there if his subjects decided to riot or to overthrow him. He could escape there to this mountain fortress and live off the proceeds for a long time. And so the food, the grain that had been stored there had been there for decades. And because it was a dry region, no moisture, the food never rotted. So it was still there decades and decades later when the Hebrews, the Jews would wall themselves into Masada during the Roman occupation and eventually would commit mass suicide famously there on Masada. But they survived that siege largely because the grain was stored in these kinds of stone warehouses for the grain. So Joseph manages the grain supply, and that's going to be important because people around are going to start coming to Egypt to receive that grain. And one of those groups of people who's going to come down to Egypt to want that grain is Joseph's brothers. His family are going to want to do that. And that's going to be the next scene in the story that we'll pick up the following week. But Joseph also has two sons, Manasseh, which means he's forgetting his former life. He's forgetting the problems that he's had, and Ephraim, who is fruitful, that God is making things fruitful. So his sons are kind of named after the two chapters we've seen here in Joseph's life. The tough stuff that he's gone through, but also the fruitfulness. God has placed him in this place for a reason. And I love how chapter 41, verse 57 puts it. All the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. And who is going to most famously come but his brothers seeking food? And that's going to put Joseph now in a position of power over them. And how he exercises that power is going to be one of the main thrusts of this story in the last few chapters of Genesis. So some thoughts here on Genesis 40 to 41. It's a major transition in the story. Joseph is elevated to this place of power, and he's going to stay there. He's as high as he can go as a slave. He's next to the Pharaoh. But his brothers and family are vulnerable due to the drought. So the situations have been reversed. Joseph seemingly has gone native. He's now an Egyptian. but he sees it as an opportunity to fulfill God's purpose. He's still a Hebrew slave, but he's being treated as an Egyptian. He's seen as an Egyptian official. He's got an Egyptian wife, but he's still acting on behalf of God's people. He never loses that, and he continues to believe in Israel's God. And he's fulfilled the dreams that he had 13 years earlier of rising to a great position of power. And in the subsequent chapters, we're going to see that come true as his brothers indeed bow before him. Now, what Joseph will do when they're in this vulnerable position is really the point of this story and the point of the end of Genesis. So just wanted to give you a little bit of a background on the text we're going to be looking at on Sunday. What I'm going to be focusing on mostly, though, is God's timing. What's the timeline for all of this? If Joseph is 17 when he is sold into slavery, the text tells us he's about 30 years old when he ascends to this high position in Egypt. That's 13 years of waiting for something to happen, 13 years of going through some really rough stuff in his life and yet coming out on top. So we're going to look at that on Sunday, talk a little bit more about God's timing as we move through our own lives. I look forward to seeing you then. Have a great rest of the week.